My name is Elliot McKenzie. I was a U.S. Marine. I was in the infantry and I was also in security forces. I wanted to be a Marine from the time that I was a little kid. I kind of knew that college wasn't for me as well. When I was in high school, I was kind of making that decision. So I knew from the time I was probably in ninth grade that I wanted to be a Marine. And so I had the American flag on my wall. I had the Marine Corps flag on my wall. I went out of my way to go running after school to make sure I got in shape for recruit training. I signed up for the delayed entry program a year early. So I actually signed up to go into recruit training the summer of my senior year, the summer before my senior year of high school. So becoming a Marine had been a long time goal for me since before even high school. And so I was well prepared. And literally 5 days after I graduated high school, I left to go to recruit training. I went to MCRD San Diego, and I was on the yellow footprints in recruit training 5 days after graduating high school, while my friends were enjoying their summers. Yeah, my time in the Marine Corps was really exciting. You usually got stuck with like one, maybe two duty stations and one MOS. And I went into the Marine Corps thinking that was going to be me because I went in just with 0311 as my primary job. And then in recruit training, I got selected for what's called Yankee White or Presidential Support Duty. And it's basically a duty where a small handful of Marines are selected to basically help guard the president in Washington, D.C. at different locations. And so I got selected for that. But in order to go into that, you first have to become a security forces Marine. So they had to give me a B billet or a second MOS, which is known as a B billet in the Marine Corps, which was 8152, which is why I also have security forces under my belt now. So I did that first for 2 years. And then I went to 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. And with them, I went to Ramadi, Iraq in '05, and then Okinawa, Japan in '06. And then I got out with an honorable discharge in 2007. So the training that you go through as a Marine Corps recruit, becoming a Marine, is the most intense and the most discipline-oriented training in the entire defense system. The DoD recognizes the Marine Corps as the top-tier service. And that's why, for example, if you are in the Marine Corps and you get out, and then you decide to join another branch like the Air Force, the Army, whatever, you do not have to go to that new branch's boot camp because the Marine Corps' boot camp is considered at the top and it's the hardest boot camp. The level of discipline that you get as a Marine, even in the beginning, all the chaos that you go through in recruit training, the physical fitness, the mental fitness, all the tests you have to take and the tests you have to pass, the psychological stuff, the discipline that gives you, and the discipline that you have to have in order to become a Marine is what really ultimately prepares you for situations that you might run into in combat. And then that alongside with a lot of training. So if they know ahead of time, which they always do, the Marine Corps will always tell battalions, hey, you're scheduled to go to Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever in this date, this time. It's usually at least 6 months out, if not more. So then they spend that next year, 6 months, whatever the time is, training for that deployment. And so now you not only have the discipline of being a Marine, but you also have 6 months to a year of combat training under your belt. But either way, whether you're a non-infantry Marine or you're a grunt, you learn the basics of combat. You learn how to fire the rifle, you learn how to fire the machine gun, you learn how to fire weapons that you're going to see in combat, you learn combat tactics, you learn camouflage, you learn all that stuff that you're going to need to know how to be successful in combat, even if you're not in the infantry. So a combination of that discipline that you get from being a Marine and then just the experience and the knowledge and the muscle memory from the training prepares you for combat, and it prepares you for pretty much any scenario that you can run into. Like I can remember in recruit training, there was the hardest day. I'll never forget it. It was the last day of the Crucible, which is like a 3-day evolution. It's like the final hardest part of recruit training that you go through to earn the title. And on the last day, we were doing, I forget how many miles it is, but it's a pretty long hike. And we had our backpacks and, all the gear on and everything like that. And it was so painful that I started crying. Like I was hiking and I was crying as I was walking. And I was in such pain, but I also remembered, I got to do this. I got to get through this. I got to get through this. I got to get through this because I want to become a Marine so bad. And so that passion and that desire to earn the title Marine is what put me through it and what got me through it. And that is a difference between the Marine Corps and the other branches. In the other branches of service, you're not really earning anything. Like you're becoming a part of the branch. Like in the Navy, for example, you're becoming a part of the Navy, and they don't really emphasize you're earning the title sailor or you're earning this, you're earning that. But the Marine Corps, the culture is such that when you go into recruit training, you're earning the title Marine. And there's a moment that you're waiting for in recruit training at the very end when they hand you the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, which is the logo, the symbol of the Marine Corps. They hand you an actual physical one, and you put your palm out like this, and your drill instructors hand it to you. And that's the moment that you go from being a recruit to being a U.S. Marine. And that's the moment that every recruit wants. And that's the goal for recruit training, because that's the day that you become a Marine. And from that day on, after you graduate recruit training, you're a Marine for the rest of your life. I found out right when I got to my unit, actually, because I had just come from security forces, because I spent that first year and a half doing security forces. And then after that, I got sent to 1st Battalion, 5th Marines to do infantry. And so I found out probably less than a week after I got to that battalion that they were going to Iraq. But I assumed that the battalion itself had found out months before, because they had already been doing training at Yuma and all these other places in Yuma, Arizona. There's a base there that is good for like desert training. And then my first day in deployment was actually interesting. I'm sitting in a porta potty on the first fob, or the first base, if you will, that we experienced when before we got to our main base. We landed at this big air base, and we had to then drive into our primary base, our primary fob, where we would be. And so while we were waiting at that bigger base to get sent into the fob, I was in a porta potty doing a number 2, and I started hearing this weird whistling sound, like a didn't really know what it was. And then all of a sudden I hear a very loud explosion, and the entire porta potty shakes for a second like that. And I'm like, oh, mortars, shit. And so I literally grabbed my pants. I bend over, grab my pants, quickly wipe, finish what I was doing. And I run out of the porta potty with my pants around my ankles. And I run over to the room where the rest of my platoon was. And I was like, what is that? And they were like, yeah, mortars, we got to go. And so we found out the hard way that mortars landed in that base because our enemy on the outside knows the base is there. So they would launch mortars inside, hoping to hit somebody. And oftentimes, unfortunately, they would. And so that was my first day in combat. Was my first experience was taking a number 2 in a porta potty and finding out that mortars happen. And that was when I realized it was real. That was when I had that aha moment of okay, I'm really in Iraq now. Because of the rules of engagement, or the ROE as we call it, basically back then the rules of engagement said that we, the Americans, were not allowed to shoot at them unless they shot at us or attacked us in some way first. So basically we kind of had to walk around and bait them, if you will. So there were, every day, our platoon, or our company actually, would do foot patrols from our fob. And so there were different ways to do patrols, again, it depends on where you are, what unit you're in, what branch you're in. There was vehicle patrols where you just drive around the city in Humvees and look for stuff, or wait to get shot at, or have specific missions. We didn't do that. Our fob was pretty small, so we didn't have a lot of room for vehicles, and so we did foot patrols. And so every single day we would do 2 to 4 foot patrols, depending on the day. And we would wake up at the crack of dawn, go eat breakfast at the chow hall. We had a small chow hall on our fob. And then get our mission briefing for the day. And then we would usually have, like I said, between 2 and 4 patrols a day. And we would just go and patrol around Ramadi. We would gear up, go walk around Ramadi, and just wait to get shot at. Because the thing about Iraq and Afghanistan, the enemy would dress up just like the civilians. And so we wouldn't be able to separate them as far as, oh, we know that's our enemy. We know that's just a guy with his wife and kids. We had to wait until they shot at us, because they all looked the same. They all dressed the same. They all acted the same until they were shooting at us. And so that's how we would, I guess, entice them into coming out of their Halloween costumes, if you will, is we would just walk around the city and wait for one of them to start shooting at us, or wait for a bomb to go off, or wait for us to get attacked somehow. And then we were able to engage the enemy. And so that's kind of what we did on a daily basis. And then outside of that, we had specific missions. We had HVT missions, which are high value target missions, where if we knew there was an individual who was the enemy, who was like the leader of a group, or who had attacked us before, it's basically like think of it like a SWAT or an FBI raid, where they know the bad guys at that house, so they send the SWAT team in to go in and get them. That's what like an HVT mission is. It's a military version of that. We know who he is or she is. We know where they live, so we're going to go to their house and get them. So we would do missions like that, as well as we would do what are called IED sweeps with the Army. So the Army had these big vehicles that were able to kind of detect improvised explosive devices in the ground. And so they would I think it was once a month or twice a month, they would come out at night and they would drive these vehicles and like kind of like mine detectors. And we would walk alongside the vehicles in case they got attacked, because those vehicles didn't have small arms, meaning like rifle fire, machine gun fire. They couldn't protect themselves in that way. So if they were to get attacked by small arms fire, we were there to shoot back for them. And so we would go on these patrols, and they would do these IED sweeps at night while we were helping guard them. And that was another regular thing we would do once or twice a month, along with the HVT missions and then just the regular foot patrols. And that made up the entire deployment, doing things like that. And then also standing posts. There were different posts around the edge of the fob to, defend the fob. And if we weren't on patrol and you got picked for, guard duty, then you were up in one of those posts guarding the perimeter of the fob for a couple hours. There were plenty of times when things happened that we weren't ready for or weren't expecting. So basically, we would take over some buildings in the city and set up posts, like the posts on our fob, on the roof, and just look into the city and see what was happening and make sure nothing was going on. And, if we saw anything happen, then we can react to it. So our platoon was designated to go into this one building and be on the rooftop. And there were Marines up on the rooftop guarding, and we were rotating every 2 hours. And I was in the building. I had just finished my shift up top. And so I was on what's called the quick reaction force. We heard rounds inbound up top. Inbound rounds, there's a very distinct sound to them. They call it snapping, because it sounds like the rounds are snapping as they hit the building, like that. And so we started hearing that, and we immediately knew we were getting shot at up top. And so myself and the other Marines that are on QRF run upstairs, and we find out that we're actually surrounded. The entire building is surrounded. And these guys had been moving very quietly through the night into these specific positions all around where this roof could see. And it was about, I want to say, between 15 and 30 guys. And they just unloaded on us. And myself and our QRF and the guys that were already up there, we fought back. We unloaded on them. And we ended up having one Marine get his left leg blown off because they shot mortars up onto the roof. And so it was just us and them. And again, Marines versus random dudes with AK-47s, we're always going to win that fight. And so it took a little while, because we started noticing, that we were surrounded. At first, it was coming from one direction. And then they started unloading from this other building over here, and then from the front. And then a couple of guys even tried to run across the street down below and shoot as they were running at us, or running across the street. And then once I think they realized, okay, we're not going to win this, then their guys started to back out one by one. And then eventually it just kind of fizzled out and the firefight ended. But no, we didn't ask for air support or any kind of help in that firefight. We just dealt with it ourselves. If I remember correctly, it was about a 30-minute firefight, but it felt much longer. When you're in the middle of a firefight, time slows down. You feel like it's been 3 hours, but it's only been 15, 20 minutes. And it's crazy how that happens. And so, yeah, I felt like it wasn't like at least an hour or two, but it turned out to be about 30-minute firefight. And we would get into firefights like that regularly. I'd say on a regular basis, if you were to put an average about once to twice a week, we'd get into firefights or get attacked somehow. Somebody popping out of a corner and shooting just a couple pop shots at us because they're scared, and they shoot and then run, to all blown out firefights, to mortars getting shot at us, to IEDs going off. That's actually how I lost my favorite company commander. He got killed when a VBI, not a VBI, an IED went off under his Humvee, and him and the Lance Corporal that was in the passenger or the driver's seat died when that bomb exploded under them. And then there was small arms fire after that. It was basically an ambush that they walked into. So yeah, we would see firefights and stuff like that on a regular basis. So one of the things that we always do and that we always train for was if we felt like there was a number of people shooting at us, we would immediately get all the saws, which are squad automatic weapons, which are basically machine guns, into the firefight as fast as possible. And it's when you have, I think we had what, 1, 2, 3 saws on top of the roof, plus all of us with regular M16s, and we had M203s, which is an M16 with a grenade launcher attached to the bottom of it. We were firing all of that at them. We were firing grenades from the 203s. We were firing regular rounds from the M16s. And then we were unloading on them with all the saws. So it was an overwhelming amount of firepower that we brought to that firefight. And I think that's what helped us win, if you will, the firefight. And that's what we brought to every single firefight. If you ever go on YouTube or any other videos and you look up Marines in a firefight in either Iraq or Afghanistan, one thing that you will always see is we overwhelm our enemy with fire. We don't just fire a couple rounds and we figure out where they're. No, we go crazy. We bring AT-4s into the firefight. Like part of Iraq, I had an AT-4, which is basically a missile, a rocket launcher. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a military rocket launcher that can destroy a tank. I carried an AT-4 on my back during our patrols for, I'd say, at least half of the deployment, just in case, so that we were ready. And there was actually one instance where our FOB got attacked, and one of our corporals at the time got so excited, he grabbed an AT-4 and he fired an AT-4 at the guy. He didn't need to, but you know, you mess with us, you wake up the demon, you're gonna get the demon. That's kind of how Marines are. And so that's how we won that fight in every fight we got into. Yes, of course, Marines got injured, got killed. We lost 16 Marines from our battalion while we were over there. But overall, we won every single firefight and every situation, every attack that we got into because of our technique of just overwhelming machine gun fire and just overwhelming fire in general from different machine guns and different weapon systems. When you're in combat, especially when you're a grunt and when you're outside the wire, you're on constant alert. And in the Marine Corps, we are trained. If you have your rifle, you have it on you at all times. It's always within at most arm's distance. And if it's not, and you get caught with it further away, you're in huge trouble. We literally sleep with our rifles like they're our spouse or they're our dog sleeping in bed next to us. An attack can happen at any time. And oftentimes attacks would happen when our enemy thought we would least expect it. And so because of that, we're trained to always be ready and always be alert. And so, yeah, absolutely. There are many times when you're restless at night, you can't sleep because you're worried about an attack coming in and having to wake up, get your uniform on, grab your gear and go. Because even on base, you're not safe over there. Like I said, my first experience was getting mortared on an army base. We landed on an army base, hung out there, that huge army base, until we drove to our base, our FOB, where it was just us. And so even on base, when you're only around other American military, you're still not safe because mortar attacks can happen and they can launch mortars over the walls and they can land, explode. And unfortunately, I've seen people get turned into what we call pink mist, which is where a bomb goes off next to you, a mortar goes off next to you, whatever, and you explode and pink mist goes everywhere because, you know, your muscle fragments in your body is exploding. And so it's like a cloud of pink mist. And so we used to call it pink mist. And there was one morning, unfortunately, on our way out, that same base we came into, me and one of my friends were walking to the chow hall, and a mortar attack happened, and we kind of just stopped and waited because at that point we were so used to it, we weren't scared, we just kind of waited. And then after the mortar stopped, we kept walking to the chow hall, and it was probably a good 200-yard walk. And as we started walking further, we started seeing pink chunks on the ground, and then we realized, And then we heard later on that a soldier had been turned into pygmies by that mortar attack. And so, yeah, you're always on alert. You're always aware. You're always on high alert, and you're always hyper aware, and you're always ready, which is why a lot of combat veterans specifically will get out of the military and then they'll experience hyper awareness and PTSD and things like that. And hyper awareness is one of the very big symptoms of PTSD. And that's why, it's because we get so used to being on that in that hyper aware mindset that it's hard to turn that back off when we come out of the military. And it's an issue that a lot of us face. After the Marine Corps, I started experiencing PTSD, anxiety, depression, hyper awareness, a whole bunch of issues. And what I learned later on was that what often happens with post-traumatic stress disorder is that it will sometimes stay dormant in your brain for whatever reason until a certain thing happens, and then that volcano, I call it, explodes. Because it's like a dormant volcano, and then suddenly it explodes. Because the interesting thing with my story is the fact that I went to Iraq in 2005. I got out of the Marine Corps 2 years later in 2007. And then after that, in mid-2007 was when my issues started to pop up. I ended up being put in a 5150 ward at a VA hospital here in California on a 72-hour hold. And they needed to evaluate me because of something that happened at home, a violent incident that I went through with my brother at home. So they evaluated me, figured out, hey, he's got severe issues. And that kind of basically started my journey with PTSD, where I ended up homeless because of it. I was living in my car for about a week, and then I ended up living at a veterans homeless shelter, or transitional housing as we call it, because you're transitioning from being homeless to trying to not be homeless. So I was in transitional housing for almost 2 years. It was like a year and 8 months or something like that. And so finally in 2015, I quit college because I was in school at the time, and I started getting intense therapy with a really great therapist who was actually a Marine Corps veteran herself. And she was the one who was able to kind of help me turn my life around. And she ended up, giving me some really, really good advice that I took and I used. And that advice basically saved my life. I think the most challenging part for me was the lack of discipline in the civilian world compared to the level of discipline in the Marine Corps. And especially being a grunt, coming from being in combat and doing a lot of training for combat to getting out and now just being in the civilian world, I was used to a certain level of standards when it came to everything I did. And then I noticed in the civilian world, those standards didn't exist. And then one of the biggest things I noticed was anger. I was always angry. I was always irritable. And anytime anything negative would happen, I would explode in anger. I would jump off at people. I would snap at people. I would want to get into fist fights with strangers who bumped into me at a random Walmart. And I later realized that anger was Iraq coming out of me, because that's kind of how you are in combat. You have to always be pissed off, always ready to go. And my body and my brain didn't turn that off when I got out. And even when you're in training, just being in the Marine Corps in general, it's a very serious, very disciplined organization. And so I got out of the Marine Corps and I was still very like, where's my attack going to come from? And I'm angry and I'm disciplined. And I was still that Marine. For example, in Iraq, one thing that they would do was they would follow us around in their cars, and they would sit in their cars and make it look like, oh, I'm just sleeping in my car. But it was actually like a spy, if you will, for the enemy. And they would call the enemy and say, oh, they're making a left on this street, or they're going down this street. Get ready over here, and then you can blow up that bomb because I think they're going to walk down that street. And so in Iraq, seeing somebody sitting in their car looking at us was a red flag, because to us, that's a spy, a lookout for them so that they can ambush us later on our patrol. And so when I got home, I started noticing every single time I saw somebody sitting in their car for no reason, like on the street, in a parking lot, just kind of chilling in their car, I'd get pissed and I'd stare at them and I'd like look at them like, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you staring at me? Or why are you sitting in your car? Are you spying on me? Like, because I thought, I was back in Iraq and I thought this person was a spy. And I had to learn over many years that people just sit in their cars. That's fine. Doesn't mean they're spying on you. It's not the enemy. They're not planning an ambush. It's just somebody chilling in their car. I started to release that anger and started to heal and change when I started to do music. That therapist I mentioned earlier, the advice that she gave me was to pursue my talents in music, because in that initial conversation of her getting to know me as a person and those first initial meetings, I told her that, I like doing music. I had been doing music since I was a kid before I joined the Marine Corps. I played drums. I was in high school drumline. I was in choir. She taught me about the science behind how natural adrenaline, like releasing endorphins and releasing adrenaline, actually combat depression and anger and PTSD naturally, because those chemicals in your brain are like the positive chemicals. And so they fight all the negative chemicals. And she was like, hey, you can use your talent that you already have to do that. When you go up on stage, do you get nervous, and that nervous negative or nervous like tick, if you will? I said, yeah. She's like, that's good. That's actually positive adrenaline releasing in your brain. She's like, when you go for a run or you go to the gym and you break a sweat, do you feel better afterwards? Yeah. Same thing. Your brain is releasing endorphins during that workout and you feel better. And when you write songs, it's like journaling. It's like getting things off your chest. It's equivalent to writing in a journal, except you're writing a song and now you're actually expressing it behind the microphone. You're recording it and you get it out physically too by singing. And so she said, use those things as natural forms of medicine and see how it works. See if it fixes things. See if it makes you feel better. So I started doing that. I bought recording studio equipment. I started writing songs and recording. I started performing at different venues and things like that. And it saved my life, literally. Taking that advice is what turned things around for me. And that was when I started to really heal and see a difference and start to really kind of relax and de-stress and not be so tense and not be so angry, was when I started doing those things and those chemicals started to release in my brain more often, and they counteracted all the negative chemicals. And I just healed, if you will. And I just got better naturally. And I was actually able to take myself off of all medications. One of my favorite stories to tell from my time in the Marine Corps was actually my first time experiencing music while I was in the Marine Corps. Because, now I'm a professional musician and I've been doing music all my life. And it was just really interesting how music even stepped into my life while I was in the Marine Corps. And it happened while I was in Japan in a couple of different ways. One was because a couple of my friends at that time knew that I could sing and they knew that I liked singing. And so they introduced me to a Marine who was stationed in Japan who had a recording studio in his barracks room, and he produced music. And so I ended up recording 2 albums with him and a couple of other Marines who rapped while I was in Japan, which was crazy because I never thought that would happen. And that was actually my very, very first experience recording any kind of music before. I had never sang behind a microphone or been in a recording studio or made music that recorded and burned to a CD or anything like that prior to that. So it was interesting because that my first experience doing that was actually while I was an active duty Marine on deployment in Okinawa, Japan, and then it was also awesome because I got my first experience like performing and being in the media, if you will, because while we were on the Navy ships during that deployment, they would do karaoke. And I didn't know about it until towards the end of that time on the ship. But one of my friends told me about it. He was like, bro, you should go sing the karaoke. We know you can sing, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, all right. So I went and I sang karaoke, and everybody in the room went crazy. And I wasn't expecting that. It was like a standing ovation, applause. And I ended up getting put into the ship's newspaper because the photographer for the ship was there. And I noticed him taking pictures of me, and he came up to me afterwards and he was like, hey, I'm going to put a small little thing about you in the ship's newspaper, because the ship would have like a newspaper every week that would come out. And I ended up getting put in the ship's newspaper, and there was the picture of me singing on karaoke night. And it was all, and I still have the actual article from that newspaper today. And so that was my first experience ever being like, I guess, in the media, if you will, and being recognized for being somebody who could sing. And so it's just really interesting that all of that happened to me while I was in Okinawa, Japan on active duty in the Marine Corps, something I didn't expect. The most impactful moment that I've had in my journey so far was when I started to get a fan base and that fan base started to talk about how my music was helping them. Because when I initially went into the music industry in 2017 and I released that single and I kind of got that journey started, I was primarily doing it thinking this is going to help me and maybe some civilians might learn from it. Like the very first single I released was Gunshots, which was a song about how combat veterans oftentimes will have sound sensitivity to things that sound like gunshots, like cars backfiring and fireworks, for example. And so it was a song from the perspective of the combat veteran experiencing that, telling the story from that first person perspective of what it's like to be a combat veteran with sound sensitivity and things that sound like gunshots. And I wrote that song and I teamed up with another Marine whose name is the Marine Rapper. And same thing, he went through a lot of the same thing. He went to Iraq. I think he went to Afghanistan, got out, dealt with PTSD and depression and a whole bunch of other issues, and then turned to music, except he raps. Me and him combined on that song, and we did a music video for it, kind of like picturing that story. So we hired actors and we did a whole music video to portray a veteran in the middle of a store that, gets triggered by something. And so I released that music video thinking, okay, maybe 50 people will see it. And it's helped me because it's helped me get some of my story off my chest. It's therapeutic for me. And maybe like 50 people will see it, civilians who don't know about this, and they'll learn, oh, this is what it's like for veterans. Okay, cool. Next thing I know, thousands of views and comments of both veterans and civilians saying, hey, this music video was so helpful. I deal with this too. This is my story too. Since then, long story short, I released a bunch of other songs that are inspirational about overcoming hard times in life and overcoming mental illness, whether you're a veteran or a civilian. And I've had a handful of people reach out to me and say, hey, your music literally saved my life. This song that you wrote literally got me through a hard time. Or the album that my first album came out in 2021. I'm working on my second one now. And my first album got a lot of people that would reach out to me and basically say, hey, your music is like really helping me. And it got me through a lot. And it pretty much saved my life. Like I've literally had veterans reach out to me and say, hey, I was considering suicide. And because of your music, I am still here. And it got to the point where I literally have tattoos on my arms of quotes from a couple of my fans that said, hey, your music literally saved my life. And so that's kind of what my purpose is now. I want to keep making music that inspires people along with traditional R&B, because I'm never going to leave the traditional R&B. That's who I am at my core. But I also want to keep making music that inspires people. Like, for example, my latest single that I just released earlier this month is called Brighter Days. And it's about understanding that even though you might be in a dark place in your life right now, something negative might have happened to you or a bunch of negative might be happening to you, stick to the fight because there are brighter days ahead. Because every single time that I have experienced that, as long as I stuck with it, I saw brighter days. And that endless tunnel of darkness finally ended and I got back to being happy and things changed. You just have to stay in the fight. And so Brighter Days is about that. It's a song just inspiring people to remember, hey, it might suck right now, but there's brighter days ahead of you. So stick with it. If you're going through something, whether it's psychological, personal with your family, a relationship, a breakup, somebody just passed, whatever you're going through, it gets better. Stick to the fight. Never quit, never give up. That's a saying that the Marine Corps drill instructors say during their initial speech to recruits is never quit and never give up, meaning like never quit recruit training, never give up, and you'll make it through. You'll become a Marine. But that also applies to just everyday life. Never quit and never give up whenever you're going through anything. And so, yeah, I think the last thing I'd want to say is just never quit, never give up, keep going. And if you like inspiration or you know anybody who needs a little inspiration, introduce them to me and my music and see if it helps.